Hi, okay, I'm Scott Crosson. I'm a longtime member of the South Atlantic. Why does it say stop sharing? Well, I guess I have that on there. All right, I'm a longtime member of the South Atlantic Council, SSC. So in contrast to a lot of the other presentations that people have been giving, this is not going to be a very scientific presentation. This is more about, I guess, how sausage is made. I mean, it's basically blue line tilefish negotiations that happened between the Mid and the South Atlantic Council SSCs a few years ago. So there was an unspoken subtitle to this. It would basically be that if you enjoy arguing with members of your council's SSC, perhaps you'd also like to argue with members of another council's SSC as well. But what happened is that, briefly, there's been a blue line tilefish fishery mostly off of the Outer Banks, going back into the early 80s. And there was a big surge in landings north of Cape Hatteras starting in the mid-aughts. And especially in the Mid-Atlantic Council's jurisdiction, just barely into the Mid-Atlantic Council's jurisdiction, but it seemed like the fish were moving into that area, and so there was suddenly an explosion of landings from both the recreational and the commercial sector from the states in the Mid-Atlantic Council's area, right above the jurisdictional boundary. And so the Mid-Atlantic Council indicated that it wanted to regulate that fishery in its area itself and not defer to the South Atlantic Council. So South Atlantic Council, both councils had to then decide how they were going to divide up that quota. And so what they did was they decided that they couldn't figure that out, so they asked their SSCs to argue about it instead. So there was a 2017 assessment. And so I'm going to go over basically what a blue line tilefish is. I'm an economist, not a stock assessment scientist, so be patient with me on that. I'll go over what I know about the northern expansion. The CDAR, the stock assessment review that we have in the South Atlantic, the review stage of the CDAR is always chaired by a member of the SSC in the South Atlantic. And so, and I volunteered to do that for CDAR 50. And the CDAR staff, basically promised me that this wouldn't be a controversial thing. This wasn't red snapper. This would be an easy one to handle. And I thought, okay, that's fine. So it did not turn out to be simple. And then we had to form a joint working group to figure out how we were going to handle all the uncertainty that came out of that. And because I had volunteered for CDAR 50 to chair the review panel, I also then was, everybody turned and looked at me and said, well, I guess you're going to chair this as well. And so I ended up running that working group. I'll talk about what information we used to divide up the quota and how we came to that conclusion, and then what the actual percentage was that we decided to divide. So blue line tilefish, it's a deep water species. There are tilefish caught also that are golden tilefish, and I guess the golden tilefish prefer the muddy bottom, but the blue line tilefish prefer the hard bottom. And so they're caught along some of the canyons as the continental shelf starts to slope away in 500-700 feet of water. Spatially, there's a fishery in the Gulf of Mexico as well that's caught along with the golden tilefish. And it's mostly, again, it's a deep water species. There's evidence biologically that a lot of the larvae are following the Gulf Stream, and so there's definitely outside recruitment that's impacting the South Atlantic region. But the stock is running up the eastern seaboard, and initially they said it went up to Virginia, but more recent papers have come out showing that it probably goes all the way up to New York. It's non-migratory once they develop. They like their little canyons, they like their little areas, and they stay there and they live for a long time period. And so in the mid-aughts, I mentioned that there was sort of this explosion, and so I'll show you a map in a second, but this area that you can sail south of New Jersey or east of Virginia or the Delmarva Peninsula or northeast and out of North Carolina, all of the commercial boats, a lot of the recreational boats, some of the charters and head boats all started coming down to that region and going after tilefish in the mid-aughts. And there was a discussion about what was happening. Were the tilefish suddenly expanding northern, into the more of a northern range, or was this somehow some stock that nobody had noticed before? But basically, a lot of the different states you can see there, were setting new records for the largest blue line tilefish caught in the space of, you can see some of those for like Virginia and Delaware. Just in the space of one summer, the record got broken 2 or 3 times. And so those just started popping up. And a lot of these landings were relatively unregulated from both the commercial or the recreational sector, depending on the state. So the catch history was not great. And so this started catching the eye of the popular news. I'm an economist, so by the popular news, I mean the Wall Street Journal and Market Watch. But it's also, I'm sure, in some of the other publications that are out there. But you started seeing it being used as an example of fisheries shifting as the climate warms. And so the scientific press also started publishing articles. You started seeing blue line tilefish thrown there along with other species that they talk about with lobsters and everything else. And so there were articles in Science and Nature. And, when we got to the CDAR stage, I walk into this, and so I have the CIE reviewers that are looking over the stock assessment report. And the landings look like this, and they're not reliable. But you can see early, before the mid-aughts, everything is basically the southern states, and that yellow is where it does something really start bumping up in the yellow right there. That is still in. Let me see. I think I have the map right below me. This is the jurisdictional boundary. All right, and actually there are some maps. I don't know where they came from, but if you start trying to Google the jurisdictional difference between the Mid and the South Atlantic, there are maps that show that the Mid-Atlantic Council's jurisdiction goes down to Cape Hatteras. It does not. It stops east. It stops at that boundary between the Virginia and North Carolina state border. If you just draw it straight east, that's the boundary between the Mid and the South Atlantic Council. That area between Cape Hatteras and the jurisdictional boundary between the two councils is much colder water. It's a big shift in the ecosystem as you get up there. And so that's where a lot of the landings historically had been, north of Cape Hatteras, but south of the jurisdictional boundary between the two councils. And so that Cape Hatteras to the boundary is the yellow. All right, so that starts jumping up, to a large degree. And then the Mid-Atlantic is represented by the red, and those started jumping up as well. But like I said, we don't know to what degree fish were being landed before that were just not being accounted for because it wasn't in the log books or the trip tickets for the different states in that region. So when we go into the CDAR, the CDAR 50 assessed the entire. This should flip down. Give it a second. I guess it's still catching up. But at any rate, we went into the CDAR and we had this assessment for the entire region. And unfortunately, because of, I'm sorry, this is really bugging me. I don't know why this is not going down. All right, so because of the difficulty with the landings history that was north of Cape Hatteras, they had to use two different models. And so south of Cape Hatteras, because we had good fisheries independent data that had been collected, they were able to use the regular production model for the stock assessment. But when it got to the north of Cape Hatteras, they had to go into using the DLM, there it goes. They had to jump into using the DLM toolkit, all right, which did not produce any kind of estimate of OFL. It didn't give any kind of indication of fishery status. It just tried to use the landings, the terrible landings data, to try and come up with some idea about what would be an acceptable amount of landings for that region north of Cape Hatteras, part of which is in South Atlantic Council's jurisdiction, part of which is in the Mid-Atlantic Council's jurisdiction. And so we asked the CIE reviewers how that should be divided up. And they told us that they couldn't find any good scientific way of dividing up that quota, all right, that north of Cape Hatteras portion of the quota between the two councils' jurisdictions. So we asked them again, and they said, no. They said the landings data is unreliable. We cannot come up with any defensible way to do this. You'll have to figure it out. And so we did have a stock status. We just had this number that we could use to set an ABC north of Cape Hatteras. So at that point, we again, I think, went back to the councils and kind of hinted that maybe they should figure out which of them are going to manage this fishery. I think at the Science Center level, I talked to my boss, the director, and asked her what headquarters was saying, and headquarters basically said the councils can manage it in their own area. Okay, so the councils then turned to the SSC and said, solve the problem that the CIE reviewers could not. All right, and so they created this working group. I was made the chair. There were members of there were 3 or 4 members of each of the SSCs. Jan was on it, I remember that. And then there was also, This boundary is difficult, okay, because these fish are just in the most awkward spot imaginable. Because not only is there a council jurisdictional area, there's also the fact that the Woods Hole handles the science going down to that boundary. All right, so now you have the Southeast Science Center is trying to handle the science on its side, and the Mid-Atlantic Science Center that they rely on is the Woods Hole. So there were representatives. We had the stock assessment scientists that had handled the assessment from Beaufort for the South Atlantic, but we also had somebody from Woods Hole who came in and was then, I guess, questioning from their perspective. So we had them, and they were involved with this. We were told, figure out what data set you can use to develop an ABC for both areas. Okay, use catch and biological data, use whatever you possibly can, figure out an appropriate methodology for dividing up the ABC, and then try and get both SSCs to sign off on it. Okay, and not come up with a number that's going to result in overfishing. So our working group met strictly via webinar. I think we met 6 times, okay, and we had a consultant that was at that point working for ASMFC, but he was familiar because he had done blue line tilefish work for his master's degree under the purview of one of the SSC members of the Mid-Atlantic Council. So he was also on the working group. He was to assist Nikolai, the Beaufort stock assessment scientist, in figuring out whatever the working group wanted to do, they would run the numbers. And so the working group met, we looked, and we decided that the fluctuations from year to year, the same result that the CIE reviewer said, that you cannot rely on this catch history. And so coincidentally, the CDAR happened in 2017. In 2018, Mike Frisk from, he's on the Mid-Atlantic SSC, he's from, I think, SUNY Stony Brook, had done a pilot study a fisheries independent pilot study in that region, and he had dipped down below the council jurisdictional boundary into that area, that north of Hatteras, south of the boundary region. And so we looked at those samples of blue line tilefish that had turned up in that survey and tried to figure out if this is something we could use. And this is it. This is the science we had. We had this, and we had bad landings data. All right, and so we all agreed that this was a pilot study that had not been designed to solve this particular problem, but this is the best thing that we could rely on. So we used that, and we ran the DLM toolkit. We had some landings data, so we made some modifications. We used a shorter time series to reduce the CV, and then we weighted the ABC using the stuff from the Frisk survey. And after we came up with that solution, 56% of that north of Cape Hatteras quota went to the Mid-Atlantic Council, and 44% went to the South Atlantic Council. And then the South Atlantic Council took that 44% and added whatever number came out of the regular stock assessment model for south of Cape Hatteras and used that for its area. So then at that point, that was our recommendation, but the SSCs had to sign off on it. All right. And we had, I guess, I had foolishly thought that the Mid-Atlantic Council would sort of their SSC would defer to whatever the South Atlantic SSC was doing, and they would just follow our control rule. But no, I went to our SSC signed off on it. We applied our control rule to the number that we had and came up with a recommendation for our council. And then I went in February up to the Mid-Atlantic SSC, and they asked questions, and then they decided that they would apply their own control rule to that. But we still came up with a number that, in theory, doesn't, there's no official OFL, but hopefully doesn't result in overfishing. This solution was not beautiful. This was only possible because of the coincidence that they had contracted, the Mid-Atlantic Council had contracted out with Mike Frisk to do that initial pilot survey. It would be much easier if one council would just regulate the whole thing. Like the Mid-Atlantic Council regulates bluefish from the entire East Coast. South Atlantic Council does it for mahi. But both councils have decided that that's not the way they want to go. They both want to keep managing in their own area. And so this was one potential solution, not an ideal solution. Olaf showed perhaps a better solution that we've been working on in recent years. But that's the story of blue line tilefish. So are there any questions?